The wind in the Montana high country did not whisper. It screamed. It was a living, starving thing that clawed at the sod roof of the cabin and ripped the frozen planks of the fence line from the posts. Clara fought it, as she had fought it every day since Amos died. Her hands, raw and split, strained against the gray, splintered wood. She tried to hold the rail in place while hammering a new spike, but the wind tore it from her grip and threw it into the snowdrift. She cursed, a sharp, smokeless puff of breath that the wind stole instantly. She was 32 years old, but the winter and the grief had carved her face into something older. She felt brittle, like the last dead leaf clinging to a branch. A sudden, panicked squawking erupted from the lean-to coop. It was a sound of terror, not just complaint. Clara's head snapped up. She dropped the hammer and ran, sinking past her knees in the snow. "No," she breathed, the word dissolving. "No, you don't." She had 3 cows, frozen solid in the north pasture since November. She had half a sack of flour, and she had 2 chickens. They were her last living, breathing claim to this place. A gray shadow bolted from behind the coop, a splash of white feathers dangling from its jaws. The coyote. Gaunt, ribs showing. It was as desperate as she was. It saw her and tried to scramble over the drift, but its paws sank. Clara didn't hesitate. She grabbed the greener shotgun leaning against the cabin wall, the metal so cold it burned her fingers through her worn gloves. She didn't aim. She pointed. The blast was deafening. A cannon shot in the frozen silence. The coyote folded, a ragged heap of fur and blood against the white. The second chicken, the one that had escaped, was flapping hysterically by the wood pile. Clara walked over to the dead animal. She nudged it with her boot. Starved. Just like everything else in this territory. She retrieved the dead hen, its body still warm, and carried it back inside, leaving the coyote for the buzzards, if any were foolish enough to be flying in this. She plucked the bird, her stomach tight with a cold, hard anger. This land took Amos, it took the herd, and it tried to take her last bit of food. She would not let it. She was stoking the fire, the smell of singed pin feathers filling the small cabin. When the knock came, it was not a knock. It was a heavy, dull pounding on the door. Clara froze. No one came here. The nearest neighbor was 12 miles east, and he was smart enough to stay inside. Traders avoided this pass after the first snow. The only person who ever came uninvited had been Amos, stumbling home drunk and mean from town. The shotgun was on the table, already loaded. She picked it up, its weight familiar. "Who's there?" Her voice was rough from disuse. A pause, then a sound like gravel rolling downhill. "Shelter." Just the one word. It was enough to make her skin prickle. She moved to the single small window, wiping the frost from the glass. He was huge, a mountain of a man, draped in furs that were so caked with ice. He looked more animal than human. He was leaning heavily on the doorframe, and even in the dying light, she could see the dark, frozen stain that covered his left shoulder and side. He looked up, and she saw his face beneath a matted tangle of hair and beard. He looked like he had been chewed up and spat out by the mountains themselves. "Go away," she said, her voice flat. "I've got nothing for you." "Don't need nothing," the man rasped, his breath pluming. "I'll trade." "I'm not interested." He staggered, catching himself. He looked past her, his gaze fixed on the wisp of smoke rising from her chimney. He looked like a man staring at salvation. "One night," he said, his voice straining. "Just the floor, till the storm breaks." "I said no." She raised the shotgun where he could see it through the glass. The man grunted. He reached with his good arm and unslung the heavy pack from his back. It fell to the snow with a heavy, muffled sound. He fumbled with the straps, his movement stiff and pained. He pulled out a bundle of skins. 10, he said. He threw them at the door. Prime beaver, tanned, 10 pelts for the floor, for one night. Clara stared at the pelts. They were dark, thick, perfect, 10. Enough to buy flour and feed and powder for a year. Enough to pay the land tax Amos had left her with. It was an absurd, desperate offer. A man would have to be dying to offer that much for a few hours by a fire. She looked back at him. He was dying. She hated this. She hated the fear that was coiling in her belly. Amos had taught her what a man's presence meant. It meant noise. It meant pain. It meant taking. The silence she had earned since his death was the only thing she owned. But the man was swaying. He wasn't a threat. He was a corpse waiting to happen. And those pelts— "Just the floor," she said, her voice sharp. "You try anything. I'll shoot you where you stand." "Just the floor," he agreed. She unbarred the door. The wind shoved it open, blasting the cabin with ice and snow. He stumbled in, bringing the smell of pine, old blood, and frozen wilderness with him. He was even bigger inside, his head nearly brushing the roof beams. He collapsed onto the dirt floor near the hearth, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. He didn't even look at her. He just curled toward the meager heat, his bad shoulder drawn up. Clara barred the door behind him, her heart hammering against her ribs. The cabin, her tiny sanctuary, felt suddenly small, crowded, and dangerous. He seemed to fall asleep instantly, or perhaps unconsciousness had just claimed him. Clara cooked her chicken, the smell of broth filling the room. She ate standing, the shotgun never leaving her sight. The man did not move. She debated. She could take the pelts and force him out, but he would die, and she had seen enough death. When it was time to sleep, she laid her thinnest quilt on the floor, a good 6 feet from where he lay. "That's yours," she said. He stirred, his eyes opening. They were pale, a watery gray, and clouded with fever. He looked at the blanket, then at her. He nodded, crawling onto it with a deep groan of pain. Clara retreated to her own narrow cot, taking the shotgun with her. She lay it beside her, her hand resting on the cold stock. She did not undress. She lay there, listening to the two sounds that filled the night, the endless shriek of the wind outside, and the harsh, wet breathing of the stranger beside her fire. Sleep wouldn't come. She watched him. The firelight cast deep shadows across his face. He was younger than she had first thought, under the grime and the beard. But it was a hard face, marked by more than just the elements. Sometime after midnight, the nightmare started. He didn't shout. He whimpered, a low, choked sound. His good hand clenched and unclenched. "No," he muttered. "Not again. Let him go. Let him." He thrashed, a violent jerk that sent a spasm of agony through his wounded shoulder. He cried out, a sharp intake of breath, and then went rigid. Clara sat up, the shotgun in her lap, the hammers pulled back. Amos had been a loud, angry drunk. He yelled in his sleep, cursed at men in his dreams. His violence was simple, like a mule's. This was different. The stranger's brokenness felt familiar. It wasn't the sound of a bully. It was the sound of a man being hunted, a sound of profound, bottomless guilt. It was a pain she recognized, not from Amos, but from the mirror. She sat there, watching him until the first gray light of dawn touched the window. She did not lower the gun, but she did not move toward him, either. When she finally rose, the cabin was bitter cold. The fire was down to pale embers. The stranger hadn't moved. He was too still. Clara walked over to him, nudging his boot with her foot. "Get up. Morning." He didn't respond. She knelt, her movements wary. She put her hand on his forehead. He was burning, a dry, searing heat that spoke of a deep infection. His breathing was shallow. She had a choice. She could drag him out, take the pelts, and let the cold finish him. It would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing. He was a man, and men were trouble. Amos had been proof enough of that. She looked at the pelts, then at the man. He had traded her a winter's survival for one night. He had kept his word. She sighed, a long, weary sound. "Damn you," she whispered. She went to the door and gathered a bucket of clean snow. Setting it on the hearth to melt, she got her sewing box, the one with the heavy sailcloth needles, and her skinning knife, and from the small chest under her cot, she pulled out the last of Amos's whiskey. She pulled back the filthy, frozen furs from his shoulder. The smell hit her instantly, sour and rank. The wound was a mess. It was puckered, swollen, and an angry, blackish purple. The shirt beneath was glued to it with dried blood and pus. "This is going to hurt," she told the unconscious man. She soaked a rag in the hot water and whiskey and pressed it to the wound. He screamed, a raw, terrifying sound, and his eyes flew open. He stared at her, not with recognition, but with pure, animal panic. His good hands shot out and clamped around her wrist like a bear trap. Clara didn't flinch. She didn't fight. She just met his gaze. His gray eyes were wild, dilated with fever and pain. "You're infected," she said, her voice calm and low. "You hold still, or you'll lose the arm. You hold still, and I'll clean it." He stared at her, his chest heaving. He was trying to focus, trying to understand where he was. He saw the cabin, the fire, the woman. He saw the knife in her other hand. He saw the bloody rag. Slowly, agonizingly, his grip on her wrist loosened. He fell back, his teeth gritted. "Who?" "Clara," she said. "Now lie still." She worked quickly, her hands sure. She had stitched up cows and horses. A man wasn't so different. She cut the shirt away, her stomach rolling at the stench. The bullet was still in there, lodged against the bone. "This part's bad," she warned. She didn't wait for a reply. She poured the rest of the whiskey straight into the wound. He roared, a sound that shook the cabin, and arched off the floor. But he didn't grab her. He just gripped the quilt in his fist, his knuckles white. Clara took the knife, sterilized in the flame, and she cut. He passed out before she fished the flattened piece of lead out. She cleaned the hole, packed it with the last of her yarrow salve, and stitched it closed with fishing line. Her hands were steady. She wrapped it in clean strips torn from her own bed linens. When she was done, she was shaking. She sat back on her heels, covered in his sweat and blood. He was pale as the snow outside, but he was breathing easier. She spent the rest of the day forcing broth and willow bark tea between his lips. He drifted in and out of consciousness. The fever raged, then broke, then raged again. He woke for real 2 days later. The storm was still blowing, but weaker. Clara was sitting at the table, cleaning the shotgun. She heard him stir and looked over. His eyes were clear. The fever was down. He looked at the new, clean bandage on his shoulder. He looked at the empty bowl by his side. He looked at her. "You dug it out," he rasped. "It was festering." He tried to sit up, and this time, he managed it, bracing himself with his good arm. He was weak, but the raw strength was still there. "Why?" "You paid for one night," Clara said, turning back to her gun. "The rest is interest. You'll live." He watched her for a long time. He took in the sparse cabin, the worn-out furniture, the way she handled the weapon with easy familiarity. He looked at the door, where the wind was still finding cracks to whistle through. "Your fence is still down," he said. "I know. And the roof on that south corner is about to give." Clara stopped cleaning. She looked at him. "It'll hold." "No, it won't," he said. "Not through another storm." He shifted, testing his arm. "I'll fix them." She raised an eyebrow. "You can barely sit." "I'll be standing tomorrow," he said. It wasn't a boast. It was a statement of fact. "I'll fix the fence and the roof in exchange for more shelter, for my keep." He was offering a trade, not asking for charity. He was a proud man, even broken. She understood that. "The work is hard," She said. "I'm strong," he replied.
"Fine," Clara said. "You fix the fence. You can stay till you're healed. Then you go."
Done. A new silence settled between them. It was different from the first night. It wasn't just fear and suspicion. It was an acknowledgement, a truce. Over the next few days, he proved true to his word. He was weak, but he was relentless. His name, he said, was Elias. He spoke little else. He spent the daylight hours outside, his bad arm tucked into his coat, hammering and sawing with his good one. The sound of his work became the new rhythm of the homestead. Thud, thud, thud. Clara watched him from the window. He worked until he was gray with exhaustion. Then came inside, ate whatever she put in front of him, and fell asleep by the fire. He never complained. He never spoke of his wound, though she knew it must be agonizing. They rarely spoke. A past the salt or a storm's turning was the extent of it, but the glances held weight. She found herself looking at his hands. They were huge, scarred, and calloused, but they were gentle with the tools, precise. He was mending her world, piece by piece. He was doing the work Amos had always promised to do, and never had. A heavy loneliness, one she had mistaken for peace, began to ache in her chest. It was a mutual quiet. He was as walled in as she was. She would catch him watching her as she kneaded bread, his gray eyes unreadable, and she would feel a strange flush of heat. The snow finally stopped, but the cold locked them in. One night, the cabin was thick with the smell of pine smoke and the stew she'd made from the second chicken. The air was close. She felt grimy, layered in sweat and wool and the tension of his presence. She needed to wash. She heated the water, her back to him. She hung the old quilt, the one he had slept on before she cleaned his wound, from a rope strung across the corner. It created a flimsy, pitiful screen. She stepped behind it, her heart thumping. This was foolish. He was right there. But she had to feel clean. She stripped off her layers, her skin rising in goose flesh. She stepped into the small metal tub, the hot water stinging. She sunk down, letting the heat soak into her bones. She scrubbed her arms, her neck, the grime of the last week. It was too quiet. The only sound was the drip of water and the crackle of the fire. She looked at the quilt. In the flickering light, she could see his shadow. He was on his cot. He was sitting up. He was watching her shadow on the cloth. Clara froze. Her breath caught. This was the moment Amos would have laughed, would have torn the barrier down and taken what he wanted. She waited, her body rigid, for the sound of his boots. Nothing. He just sat. He just watched. A strange, defiant heat bloomed in her belly. It was not fear. It was something else, something sharp and alive. She was being seen, not grabbed, not hurt, just seen. Slowly, deliberately, she lifted her arms. She unpinned her hair, letting it fall. She began to wash it, her shadow moving, stretching, her arms rising and falling, her neck exposed. She was testing him. She was testing herself. He did not move. She finished, her skin flushed red from the heat and the scrubbing. She stepped out, dried herself quickly, and pulled on her long flannel nightgown. Her hands were shaking. She took a deep breath. She pulled the quilt down from the rope. Elias was sitting exactly as his shadow had shown, but he wasn't looking at her. He was staring deep into the fire, his expression tight, his hands fisted on his knees. The air between them was so thick she could barely breathe it. She said nothing. She went to her cot, slipped under the blankets, and turned her back to him, the shotgun still within reach. But she knew, as she lay there staring at the rough cabin wall, that she would not be using it tonight. The days that followed settled into a quiet, heavy rhythm. Elias proved his word. He was a man who did not waste motion. His first task was the fence line. Clara watched from the window as he worked, his wounded shoulder held stiff, his good arm doing the work of two. He did not just hammer the old planks back on. He dug new post holes, wading through thigh-deep snow to find solid ground, setting the posts with a grim, steady determination. He was strong, yes, but it was his patience that held her. Amos would have cursed, thrown the hammer, and given up, blaming the frozen ground or the bad wood. Elias just worked. He met the land's resistance with his own silent, unyielding will. He rarely spoke. The silence in the cabin was no longer empty. It was full of his presence, the sound of his breathing, the scrape of his knife as he carved triggers for his traps, the soft thud of his boots on the floor. When he did speak, his voice was low, deliberate, as if he measured each word before releasing it. "I need the axe. Water's low." "It'll hold." Each short phrase landed with the weight of a stone. It was a language she was not used to. Amos had filled the world with noise, with boasts and promises, and, later, with slurred accusations. Elias's quiet was a balm. It was reliable. She found herself talking, just to fill the space. At first, it was small things. The weather, the chickens, the way the snow drifted against the north wall. He would nod, his gray eyes fixed on his work. One evening, the wind was low. A rare stillness had fallen over the territory. She was mending one of her wool stockings, the needle pushing through the thick yarn. He was oiling his rifle, the metal parts laid out on a piece of hide on the table. The cabin was warm, smelling of wood smoke and coffee. "This place was supposed to be a new start," she said, her voice sounding strange and loud in the quiet. Elias did not look up, but his hands stilled. She took it as encouragement. "Amos, my husband, he heard there was gold in Alder Gulch. He heard a man could make a fortune. He bought this claim with the last of my father's money. Said we'd be rich in a year. Said we'd have a big house. Cattle." She jabbed the needle through the wool. "He never even bought the cattle." She waited. Elias carefully wiped the breech block, his scarred hand surprisingly precise. "He liked the town more than the homestead," she continued, the words coming easier now, a stream thawing. "He liked the saloon, the cards. He was not a lucky man, but he was a hopeful one, always sure the next hand would be the one." "Hope is a costly thing," Elias said, his voice a low rumble. "It cost me everything," she whispered. "He left debts. He owed money to Mr. Finch at the bank, and he owed money to Silas Croft." She spat the name like it was poison. "Croft runs the land office, but he runs the saloon too. He owns most of the men in town, one way or another." She looked at her hands, at the needle. "Amos came home one night, drunk, worse than usual. He said Croft had offered him a deal, said he would forgive the debt, all of it." Clara's hands were shaking. "Croft wanted the land, and he said he wanted me too, for the winter. Said he'd take the debt out and trade if Amos couldn't pay." The cabin was dead silent. The only sound was the faint pop of an ember in the hearth. Elias slowly, deliberately, began to reassemble the rifle. Click, snap, the sound of metal meeting metal. "Amos, he told me he was thinking on it, thinking on selling me for a few months to settle a card debt." Her voice broke, thick with a shame so old it felt like part of her bones. "He died 2 days later. His horse threw him, and he broke his neck. And I was glad, God forgive me, I was so glad he was dead." She had never said those words aloud. She looked at Elias, expecting disgust, judgment, anything. He met her gaze. His eyes were not cold, but they were not soft. They were hard, like forged steel. "Has Croft been back?" "No, not since the funeral. He sent a man to offer condolences. I told him to get off my land. He laughed." "He'll be back," Elias said. It was not a guess. It was a fact. "When the thaw comes, he'll be back." He stood, his full height seeming to shrink the cabin. He checked the action on the rifle, then set it against the wall. He looked at her, his face shadowed. "He won't find you alone." Clara stared at him, her heart doing a slow, painful turn in her chest. It was the first time in her life a man had offered her protection without asking for a price. The next day, the wind returned. It did not come slowly. It hit the cabin like a train, a solid wall of shrieking ice and snow. The sky vanished, replaced by a churning, violent white. The world shrank to the four walls of the cabin. For 2 days, they were trapped. The tiny space became a pressure cooker. They could not go outside, not even to the wood pile. Elias had brought in a large stack, and it dwindled alarmingly as he fed the hearth, fighting the monstrous cold that seeped through the chinks in the logs. They moved around each other in a careful, awkward dance. When she cooked, he sat on his pallet, sharpening his skinning knife until the edge gleamed. When he needed to get to the wood, she had to press herself against the wall to let him pass. His arm would brush her side, a touch of wool and solid muscle, and she would flinch, her skin prickle. The tension was a third person in the room. It was the heavy silence after she had spoken of Amos. It was the way his eyes lingered on her neck as she stirred the pot. It was the memory of her shadow, naked and vulnerable, on the hanging quilt. The first night of the storm, the cabin grew deadly cold. The fire, no matter how high Elias built it, could not beat back the cold of the blizzard. Clara lay on her cot, buried under every blanket she owned. And still, she shivered. From the floor, she heard a sound, a faint, rhythmic clicking. She sat up, in the dim, flickering light of the fire. She saw Elias. He was on his pallet near the door, curled on his side, his bad shoulder protected. He was shaking. His teeth were chattering. A desperate, involuntary rhythm he was trying to suppress. He had given her the better spot, closer to the hearth. He had taken the drafty floor, and the cold was sinking into his bones, into his half-healed wound. She lay there, her heart a cold knot. It is not my concern. He is a stranger. But the sound, it was a sound of pure, human misery. It was the sound of the coyote she had shot, a creature at the end of its rope. She threw back her blankets. The air was so cold it stung her lungs. He heard the movement. His eyes snapped open, instantly wary. "What is it?" "You're freezing," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind's howl. "I'm fine. You're a bad liar." She grabbed the thickest quilt from her cot, the one her mother had made, and walked to him. "I don't need—" "Be quiet," she ordered, her voice sharp. She unfolded the quilt and spread it over him, tucking it in around his shoulders. He was still shaking. She hesitated. This was not enough. The cold was too deep. She looked at her cot, then at the floor. With a sigh that seemed to pull the last of her resolve from her, she grabbed her other blanket. She did not go back to her bed. She laid the second blanket on the floor, next to his pallet, not touching, but close, close enough. She lay down, her back to him, and pulled the edge of his new, heavy quilt over herself. They were two separate people, on two separate beds, sharing a small ocean of warmth. She did not sleep, but after a long, long time, she heard the chattering of his teeth stop. She heard his breathing deepen, and she lay in the dark, listening to a man sleep peacefully, a foot away from her. The storm broke on the third morning. The silence was as stunning as the noise had been. The world outside was a pristine, glittering white, the sky a painful, sharp blue. The tension inside, however, had not broken. It had changed. It had coiled tighter. That evening, they sat by the fire, exhausted from a day of digging out. They had cleared a path to the coop and the woodpile, the work hard, the air biting. Elias's shoulder was clearly paining him, but he said nothing. Clara sat on the small stool, brushing her hair. She had unbound it, letting the heat of the fire dry it. It fell over her shoulders, a plain brown curtain. Elias was watching her. He had been watching her all day. She could feel his gaze like a physical touch. He was sitting on his pallet, leaning against the wall. He reached out, his big scarred hand moving slowly, as if not to startle her. A long strand of her hair had fallen forward, resting on her shoulder. He hooked it with his forefinger, his touch impossibly light, and tucked it behind her ear. His rough fingers grazed the skin of her neck. It was not a grab. It was not a demand. It was gentle. A jolt went through Clara, so powerful it stole her breath. Her eyes closed, her entire body, starved for a touch that was not violent, for a kindness she had only read about, leaned toward his hand. It was a pure animal instinct, a flower turning to the sun. Then panic. Cold, sharp, and visceral. The ghost of Amos was in the room, laughing his wet, cruel laugh. Easy, aren't you? She jerked back as if she'd been burned. Don't, she whispered, her voice tight and ugly. She scrambled to her feet, her hair falling back into her face. She fled to her cot, turning her back to him, her shoulders rigid. She heard him let out a long, slow breath. He did not speak. He did not move. She lay there, trembling with a volatile mix of shame and a terrifying, aching want. She was up before dawn, her self-loathing a bitter taste in her mouth. She was furious at him for touching her, furious at herself for leaning in. She dressed in the dark and went outside. The air was frigid, the stars still blazing in the black sky. She grabbed the heavy splitting maul. She needed to break something. She attacked the wood pile. She swung the maul with a frantic, desperate energy. She was not just splitting wood. She was trying to destroy the feeling in her chest, the loneliness, the shame, the awful, humiliating desire for something more than just survival. She swung again and again, grunting with the effort, tears of rage freezing on her cheeks. She was punishing herself for her weakness. She was punishing the wood for being there. Clara! His voice came from the cabin door. She ignored him, raising the maul again. A log split with a sharp crack. Clara, stop! Leave me be, she snarled, swinging wildly. The maul hit the edge of the log, glancing off and burying itself in the snow near her boot. She heard the crunch of his steps. He was there, standing over her. You'll hurt yourself. What do you care? She tried to wrench the maul free, but it was stuck. Let me go! He put his hand on the handle. Stop it! Get your hands off! She yelled, pulling. He did not fight her. He simply took the maul from her hands. His strength was effortless, absolute. He did not raise his voice. He just took it. And she broke. The strength that had been holding her upright for 2 years, the anger that had fueled her, it all dissolved. She collapsed against the woodpile, the rough bark biting into her back. She didn't weep. She sobbed, dry, gasping, ugly sounds that were torn from her throat. I can't, she choked out, beating one fist against the frozen logs. I can't do this anymore. I can't. Elias stood over her, a massive, silent shadow against the emerging dawn. He did not touch her. He just waited. I'm so alone, she wept, the words ripped from her. Every day, it's so cold, and I'm ashamed. Ashamed of what? His voice was low, cutting through her grief. Of this, she gestures at the cabin, at the snow, at him, of wanting, of seeing you and feeling. I'm so tired of just surviving. I'm tired of being afraid of a kind touch. I'm tired of being so hungry I'd... She looked at her hands. She'd been gripping the wood so hard her nails had bitten into her palms, leaving crescent moons. I'm not who I was. I'm just this animal, like that coyote. He was silent for a long time. The only sound was her ragged breathing and the faint call of a snowbird. You're not an animal, Clara, he said, his voice rough. You're a survivor. There's no shame in that." He offered her his hand, his good hand. She stared at it. It was scarred, calloused, but it was steady. After a long moment, she took it. He pulled her to her feet as if she weighed nothing. That night, the cabin was still. The truth lay bare between them. The pretense of stranger and widow was gone. They were just two people, pared down to the bone. She sat on her stool by the fire. He was at the table. The silence stretched, but it was not the tense, electric silence of before. It was a clear, empty space. He stood up. He walked to her. She tensed, her old fears rising. But he didn't loom. He knelt in front of her, bringing his great height down to her level. He looked at her face, then down at her hands, which she had scrubbed and bandaged. He reached out and took both her hands in his. He held them, his large, warm palms enclosing her fists. "Clara," he said, "just her name." She began to tremble, a deep, seismic tremor that started in her stomach. I'm afraid." "I know," he said. His own voice was strained. "Me too." He did not kiss her. He did not pull her. He just held her hands. He lifted one, turned it over, and brushed his thumb over the raw knuckles of her right hand. A touch so light, so careful, it made her want to cry out. She was the one who moved. She leaned forward, just an inch, a small, terrifying motion. He met her. His lips were not soft. They were chapped, rough from the wind, like his hands, but the kiss was slow. It was not the bruising, wet, selfish kiss of Amos, a kiss that was always a prelude to a demand. This was a question. It was uncertain, hesitant, tasting of salt and wood smoke. It held no demand. It just asked. Her answer was to lift her bandaged hand from his grasp and place it on his rough cheek. His beard scratched her palm. He let out a shaky breath, a sound that seemed to come from deep inside him. His grip on her other hand tightened, not with force, but with an intensity that bordered on pain. He was a man drowning, and she was the first solid thing he had touched in a year. He pulled back, his gray eyes searching hers. "Are you sure?" She looked at this massive, broken man kneeling at her feet. "I'm not," she whispered, her voice trembling. "And I don't care." He rose, lifting her as he did. He carried her the 2 steps to her narrow cot and laid her down. The motions were slow, deliberate, almost clumsy, as if they were both unlearning everything they thought they knew. This was not a fire. It was a thaw. It was the slow, aching, sometimes painful melting of 2 people who had been frozen for a long, long time. He was tender, his hands exploring her shoulders, her arms, her face, as if he were memorizing her. And he was intense, his body a solid, heavy warmth that she craved. When he finally moved over her, she trembled. It was not fear. It was a need so profound, so deep. It was a hunger that had nothing to do with food. It was the need to be held, to be wanted, to be touched with something other than violence. It was an emotional release so total it left them both shaking and breathless in the quiet of the cabin. For the first time since Amos had died, Clara did not sleep alone. She slept in the arms of the stranger, his body a solid wall behind her, his breathing a deep, steady rumble that she felt in her own chest. She slept, and she felt safe. She woke in the deep, cold hours before dawn. The cabin was dark. The fire burned down to a pile of glowing orange embers. She felt a moment of panic. He was not beside her. Then she saw him. He was sitting on the floor by the hearth, just as he had been that first night. He had pulled on his trousers. A single blanket was draped over his bare shoulders, his bandaged wound a pale shadow in the gloom. He was not asleep. He was staring into the dying fire, his back to her, perfectly still. He was a man deep in thought, a man who had seen something in the flames that he did not like. He was a man who knew the cost of what had just happened. Clara lay there, the cold air touching her bare shoulders, and watched him. The simple, profound peace of the night had evaporated, replaced by a new, more complicated worry. The world had been held at bay by the storm. Now, the storm was over, and she knew, without him saying a single word, that the world was about to come knocking. Clara woke to the cold. The blankets on the cot were tangled around her legs, but the solid, heavy warmth that had anchored her through the night was gone. She sat up, her heart a cold stone in her chest. The cabin was gray with the first weak light of dawn. Elias was sitting by the hearth, just as she had seen him. He had not moved. He was still staring into the embers, a man carved from shadow. He had pulled his woolen shirt back on, but he had not bothered to button it. The new, clean bandage on his shoulder was a stark white in the gloom. "You're not sleeping," she said. It was not a question. He did not turn. His voice was a low rumble, as flat and dead as the ashes he was watching. "I shouldn't have stayed. I shouldn't have touched you." Clara pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders. The warmth of the night, the profound, trembling peace she had felt, was evaporating. "Why? Because you're a man, or because you're you?" "Because I'm me." He finally turned his head, and his face in the dim light was a geography of old pain. "I bring trouble. Clara, not the kind you can scare off with a shotgun, the kind that follows, the kind that burns places like this to the ground." She waited. The silence stretched, filled only by the wind starting its morning complaint. "You asked me why I was wounded," he said, his gaze dropping back to the fire. "I told you it was a bad fall. I lied." He took a deep, ragged breath. "I used to hunt men, for money, a man-catcher, a bounty hunter." He said the words like they were poison on his tongue. "I was good at it. I was strong. I could track anything, and I didn't ask questions. The warrant was all that mattered. The money was all that mattered." He picked up a small stick from the kindling box and began to poke at the embers, his hands shaking. Not from cold, but from something deeper. "A year ago, I took a warrant from a sheriff in the Wyoming Territory. A man named Barlow. He wanted a kid brought in, 19, maybe 20 years old. Name of Jamie. Warrant said robbery and horse theft. I tracked him for 3 weeks. Found him in the Bighorns. He was just a boy. He was terrified. He swore he didn't do it. He swore Barlow was the criminal. I didn't listen. They always say that." Elias's voice went thick. He tried to run. The warrant said dead or alive. It was easier to bring him back dead." The stick in his hand snapped. "I shot him," Elias whispered. "He was running. I shot him in the back. I brought him in, draped over his own saddle, and Sheriff Barlow paid me $60. He smiled when he paid me." Clara did not move. She did not breathe. "I went to Denver. I spent the money. But the kid, I couldn't get him out of my head. The way he looked at me." He rubbed his face with his good hand. "I rode back. I started asking questions, not as a hunter, just as a man. It wasn't hard to find. Everyone in that town was terrified of Barlow." "Jamie! The kid! He hadn't stolen anything. He'd seen Barlow and his deputies murder a freighter for his cargo. He was a witness. He was just a homesteader, trying to build a life. And I murdered him for $60, so Barlow could cover his tracks." He stood up then, a violent, sudden movement. He began to pace the small cabin, his size making the room feel like a cage. "I went back for Barlow. It wasn't about the law. It was about, I don't know. It was about something. I found him in the saloon. I told him what I knew. I told him I was going to the territorial marshal. He laughed. He tried to have his deputies arrest me." Elias stopped, his back to her. "It wasn't a clean fight. I left him alive, I think, but 2 of his men weren't so lucky. And I ran. I've been running ever since." He turned to face her, his gray eyes burning with a self-hatred that was hotter than the fire. "Barlow put a price on my head, a big one. For murder, for attacking an officer of the law. He wants me dead. Clara, He needs me dead, so I can never tell what I know. And every bounty hunter from here to the border wants to be the one to collect. That bullet you dug out of my shoulder, that was from one of them. I'd been riding for 2 days, bleeding, before I found this place." He stepped toward the cot, looming over her. "I slept in your bed. I put my life in your hands. And by doing that, I've marked you. I've brought this here. When they find me, and they will not care that you are a widow just trying to survive. They will see you as my accomplice. My whore." He waited for her to recoil, for the fear, the disgust, the judgment. Clara held his gaze. The storm of his confession passed over her, and she did not flinch. She saw the guilt that was eating him alive. She saw the man who had stopped her from chopping wood in a rage. She saw the man who had gently tucked her hair behind her ear. Slowly, she shook her head. "Men like Barlow," she said, her voice quiet but strong. "Men like Silas Croft. They're all the same. They just use different weapons. Some use warrants. Some use poker debts." She stood, pulling the blanket around her like a robe. She walked past him, past the hearth, to the far wall. She knelt by her cot, pushed it aside, and worked a loose plank from the floor, from the dark, dusty hole beneath. She pulled a small, leather-bound ledger. She stood and held it out to him. "You think you've marked me, Elias. I was marked the day I said, 'I do.' I was marked long before you ever knocked on that door." He took the book, his brow furrowing. He opened it, his big fingers clumsy on the thin pages. "My husband," Clara said, her voice flat and cold, "was a man of accounts. He wrote down everything." Elias turned the pages, his lips moving silently as he read the cramped, spidery script. He saw the entries. O.S. Croft, $20. Cards. O.S. Croft, $50. Whiskey. O.S. Croft, $30. The debt grew, page after page, a chronicle of his own slow ruin. "Turn to the last page," Clara said. He did. The page was dated 3 days before Amos had died. The handwriting was shaky, but the words were clear. "He called it Croft's final settlement," Clara said, her voice a dead monotone. "He wrote it all down. Croft would forgive all outstanding debts, $180. Plus, he would give Amos $100 in cash." Elias looked up at her, his eyes dark with confusion. "In exchange for the deed to the homestead," Clara said. "And for me, he wrote it. Winter tenancy of Clara." Those were his words. Croft wanted the land, and he wanted me to warm his bed until the spring thaw. And Amos was going to sell me, like a cow, like a pelt. She pointed to the bottom of the page, to the 2 small, triumphant words. "Read what he wrote." Elias read them aloud, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Agreed. Settle Tuesday." "He died on Monday," Clara said. She took the journal from his numb grasp and put it back in the hole. "His horse threw him on the way back from town. He was drunk, celebrating the deal he just made. So don't you talk to me about being marked. Don't you talk to me about what men deserve. Your guilt is for one boy you didn't know. My shame is for the man I did." She put the floorboard back in place. "We all have ghosts. Elias, yours carry guns. Mine carried a wedding ring and a bottle. I'm not afraid of your ghosts. I'm just tired of my own." He looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time. Not as a fragile widow, not as a simple homesteader. He saw a survivor, as scarred and as hunted as he was. The confession did not drive them apart. It forged a new, harder, more brittle bond between them. The days that followed were quiet, but the quiet had changed. It was no longer an absence of sound. It was a preparation. They worked. He finished the fence line, his movements growing stronger as his shoulder healed. He split the rest of the wood, creating a fortress of logs against the cabin's west wall. She recaulked the windows, using the last of her tallow. They shared the cot at night, but it was a chaste, somber comfort. They lay side by side, back to back, two soldiers waiting for a battle. The battle arrived on a Tuesday, 2 weeks after the storm. It didn't come with gunfire. It came with a knock. Elias had his rifle in his hands before the sound faded. He moved to the window, motioning for her to stay back.
"Who is it?"
Clara whispered. "One man, on a tired horse, looks like a mail rider." Clara let out a breath. "It's just the boy from town. He comes once a month, if the pass is clear." "Stay here," Elias ordered. He opened the door a crack, his body blocking the opening, the rifle held low. A young man, no older than 20, peered at him. He was covered in snow, his face raw with cold. This the Barrow homestead?" "Clara Barrow." "What do you want?" Elias's voice was a growl. "Letter," the boy stammered, intimidated by the giant armed man in the doorway. "From the Territorial Land Office. From Mr. Croft." Clara pushed past Elias. "I'm Clara Barrow. Give it to me." The boy handed her the oilskin pouch, glad to be rid of it. He touched his frozen hat. "Ma'am?" He didn't wait. He spurred his horse around and retreated down the path as fast as the snow would allow. Clara shut the door. The cabin felt airless. She fumbled with the pouch, her fingers stiff and numb, though not from cold. She pulled out the single, folded piece of paper. Elias watched her. He saw the blood drain from her face. He saw her hand begin to shake.
"Clara?"
"He's doing it," she whispered, her eyes wide with a dull, familiar terror. "He's taking it." She read the letter aloud, her voice trembling, gaining a hysterical edge with every word. "Notice of abandonment, pursuant to Territorial Statute Section 4, regarding homestead claims. Property found unoccupied, unimproved, and in arrears. A formal counterclaim has been filed by Mr. Silas Croft." She looked at Elias, her eyes blind with panic. It says I have 30 days. 30 days to appear in person at the land office in town to prove continued occupancy and pay all outstanding property taxes and fees. 3 years' worth. It's $40. She crumpled the paper in her fist. 30 days. In this, he knows I can't get to town, and he knows I don't have $40. "He's stealing it," Elias said. The words were flat. He took the crumpled paper from her, smoothed it out, and read it himself. "He's a smart bastard. It's all legal." Clara sank onto the stool. Her shoulders slumped. The fight she'd shown him just days before was gone, extinguished by the cold. Official words on the page. "It's over. He won. He just waited until Amos was dead and the winter set in. He knew I'd be trapped. He won." "No," Elias said. The word was so sharp, it made her jump. He slammed his good fist onto the table. "You fight it." "Fight it?" She let out a laugh, a bitter, broken sound that scared her. "Fight him? Silas Croft? With what? Elias? He's the land agent. He's the bank. He is the law in that town. I'm a widow with no money. You're a wanted man. What do? Walk in there and show him your rifle? They'll hang us both." "You go," he insisted, leaning over her, his intensity a physical force. "You ride that mule to town. You walk into that office. You shove that paper in his face. And you tell him you've been here. You tell him you've been working. You show him your hands." "And what?" she cried, jumping to her feet. "He'll laugh. Elias. He'll ask where I got the money. He'll ask who the man is living in my cabin. He'll call me a liar. He'll call me a whore. And he'll take my land anyway. I can't win. You don't understand. Men like him, men with power, men with money, they don't lose." "Then I'll go," he said, his voice dropping to a low growl. "You?" She stared at him. "You'll walk into the land office, and the first thing you'll see is a poster with your face on it, offering $500 for your neck. You'll be in chains before you can even say my name." She began to pace, her hands twisting in her apron. "It's hopeless. It's the land. It's cursed. She stopped, a wild, desperate idea taking root. We leave. That's what we do. We leave. Right now. You have your mule. I have the pelts you gave me. 10 prime pelts. That's enough. Enough to get to Oregon. Enough to start over. Somewhere else. He grabbed her arms, his grip hard, forcing her to be still. Run! Is that your answer? Run and let him win. Let him take this. I have nothing, she shouted, trying to pull away from him. This isn't a home. It's a prison. It's a monument to every bad decision Amos ever made. Let him have it. It's yours, Elias said, his voice raw. You bled for it. You fought for it. You survived your husband for it. You don't let a snake like Croft take it with a piece of paper. I can't, she wept, the fight draining out of her, leaving only the old, familiar despair. I can't win against him. He looked at her, his gray eyes searching her face. I've seen worse men fall, he said, his voice quiet. I've seen men who thought they were kings end up with nothing. But they didn't fall because people ran. They fell because someone, somewhere, stood still. You have to stand still. Clara, you have to fight. She turned away from him, pulling her arms free. She went to the window and stared at the endless, blinding white. You don't know what you're asking. The next morning, the silence in the cabin was a weapon. They had not shared the cot. She had stayed there, and he had taken his blankets to the floor. The unspoken argument hung in the air, cold and heavy. Clara woke late. The cot beside her was empty. The cabin was empty. Panic, sharp and cold, seized her throat. Elias. She scrambled out of bed. His rifle was gone from the wall. His pack was gone from the corner. She ran to the door, her stockinged feet sliding on the cold floor. She threw it open, bracing against the wind. He was there, standing by the lean-to. He had packed his mule. The 10 beaver pelts he'd given her were stacked neatly by her door, but his own meager supplies were strapped to the saddle. He was checking the cinch, his back to her. You're leaving, she said. It was not a question. He stopped, his hand on the rope. He did not turn. He's right, Croft. You can't win, not with me here. They'll find out. They'll use me against you. They'll say you're harboring a fugitive. They'll take the land, and you'll go to jail. So you're just running away. I'm drawing them off, he said, his voice flat. He turned to face her. His face was a mask of cold resolve. The man who had knocked on her door. All traces of warmth gone. I'll head south, toward the pass, make some noise. Someone will see me. Word will get back to Barlow's men. They'll follow me. It gets me away from you. It gives you a chance. He was doing what he thought was right. He was sacrificing himself, drawing the danger away. He was leaving her. Alone. The word echoed in her head. Alone, alone, alone. He picked up his rifle, slung it over his bad shoulder. He walked past her, toward the cabin, to retrieve the last of his things. She stood aside, frozen. He was going to walk away. He was going to leave her to face Silas Croft, to lose her land, to go back to being the frozen, half-dead widow just waiting to die. He brushed past her at the doorway, and she moved. She did not speak. She did not cry out. She simply reached out and took his hand, his good hand, the one that had held hers, the one that had split her wood. Elias froze. He stopped, his back to her, and looked down at her small, chapped hand covering his. She tugged, a small, gentle, insistent pull. He was a mountain, but he followed. He turned, his face a mask of confusion, and let her lead him. She led him away from the door, away from his mule, back into the dim warmth of the cabin. She led him to the narrow cot, the one they had shared. She sat on the edge of it and looked up at him. The tears she had refused to shed now streamed down her face, but she made no sound. Don't, she whispered. Clara, he said, his voice breaking. I am danger, I am death. I'll destroy you.
I don't care. She reached up, her hand gripping the rough wool of his coat. I was surviving. I was alone. That's all it was. Just surviving. Then you came, and I felt, I don't know, I felt alive. She clutched his coat tighter. It hurts. It's terrifying. But I don't want to go back. Don't leave me alone again. Please. He looked down at her, at the woman who was holding onto him like he was the last solid thing on earth, the stone in his face, the cold resolve. It all cracked. He was the one trembling now.
They will come, he said, his voice hoarse. They will come for both of us.
Let them, she whispered. I'm tired of being afraid.
She pulled him down.
He fell to his knees before her, and his arms went around her waist, crushing her to him. He buried his face in her stomach, his shoulders shaking. This was not the slow, healing thaw of their first night. This was a fire. It was the urgency of the letter, the threat of his past, the terror of her future, all colliding. His mouth found hers, and it was not a question. It was a statement, a desperate, claiming kiss that tasted of fear and iron. He pushed her back onto the cot, his body covering hers, his hands in her hair. It was not tender. It was raw. It was vulnerable. It was a desperate plea from two people who had been alone for too long. Their clothes were a barrier, torn away with frantic, clumsy hands. She clutched him, her nails digging into the scarred skin of his back, as if she could hold him there, hold him against the entire, cold, uncaring world. Stay, she panted against his mouth. Stay. Swear to me you'll stay. He moved, their bodies joining, a desperate, anchoring weight. I'll fight for you, he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. He gripped her hips, his head bowed, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Clara, I promise, I'll fight for them all. She held him, her legs wrapped around him, her tears soaking his hair. They were not two survivors. They were one, a single defiant act of war against the cold, against the past, and against the men who were coming for them. He did not leave. He collapsed beside her, pulling her against his chest, his arm a heavy, possessive bar across her waist. They lay there, breathing, as the morning light filled the small, silent cabin. They'll come, she whispered, her voice muffled against his skin. He kissed the top of her head. Let them, he growled. We'll be ready. The promise he had made to her was a new, heavy weight. It was not the vague hope of survival. It was a solid, defined pact. He had promised to fight, and fighting meant leaving her, if only for a day. You stay here, he told her, the morning cold and sharp. You keep the shotgun loaded. You don't open the door for anyone. Where are you going? She asked, her hands twisting in her apron. The vulnerability of the night before had been replaced by a brittle, shared dread. To town, he said, strapping his knife to his belt. Croft gave you 30 days. We're not giving him one. I'm going to delay that filing. Elias, you can't. Barlow. Barlow is a maybe. Croft is a definite. He reached for the pelts he had given her, the 10 prime beavers that had been his entry fee. He selected 2 of the darkest, thickest skins. This was your payment. I'm using it. What about the $40? I don't have $40, he said, his voice flat. But I have these, and I have $10. I'm not going to pay the tax. I'm going to bribe the clerk. I'm going to buy you time. He left her with the rifle and the shotgun. He took his mule and his sidearm, pulling his hat low to shadow his face. The ride to Three Forks was 12 miles of agonizing, exposed tundra. Every ridge, every stand of pine felt like an ambush. He felt naked, his back itching where he'd been shot before. He was no longer a ghost in the mountains. He was a man walking into a trap. The town was choked with snow and smoke. Men in thick coats hurried between the saloon and the general store. No one gave him a second glance. He was just another trapper. Come in from the high country. He tied his mule, his gut coiling tight. The territorial land office was warm. It smelled of hot iron from the stove, dried ink, and stale tobacco. A young, thin-necked clerk with spectacles sat behind a high counter, scribbling in a ledger. He looked up, his expression annoyed, and then his eyes widened. Elias filled the doorway. "Help you?" the clerk asked, his voice squeaking. Elias walked to the counter. He dropped the 2 heavy pelts on the wood. The clerk stared at them. They were worth $30. Easy. "I'm here for Clara Barrow," Elias said, his voice a low rumble that didn't carry. The clerk's face went from nervous to guarded. That's a private matter. Mr. Croft is handling that." "I'm here to file a correction," Elias said. He reached into his coat and pulled out a $10 gold piece, placing it on top of the pelts. "This is the filing fee." The clerk looked at the money, then at the pelts, then at Elias's hard, scarred face. I don't understand. The notice of abandonment, it's a mistake. She's been there. She's occupying the land. She's improving it, but the snow has been bad. She can't get to town to sign the correction herself." "Well, Mr. Croft would have to approve." "Mr. Croft is a busy man," Elias interrupted, his voice dropping. He pushed the pelts and the gold piece forward. "And this is a simple filing error. Paperwork gets lost, right?" He held the clerk's gaze. "This is for you, for your trouble. The pelts, they're a gift. For Mr. Croft, to thank him for his patience." The clerk's eyes darted to the inner office, where Croft's name was painted on the glass. He swallowed. He licked his lips. He reached a shaky hand toward the gold piece. The bell on the front door jangled. Both men looked. Elias froze. His blood didn't just run cold, it stopped. The man standing in the doorway was tall, thick in the chest, with a heavy gray mustache and the coldest blue eyes Elias had ever seen. He wore a long duster, and pinned to it, plain as day, was the badge of a Wyoming sheriff. Sheriff Barlow. Time slowed. Barlow's gaze swept the room, dismissive of the clerk, and then it landed on Elias. There was no flicker of uncertainty, only recognition. A slow, cold smile of profound satisfaction spread across Barlow's face. He had found his prey. Barlow's hand moved, not fast, but deliberately, toward the butt of his gun. "File it," Elias growled at the clerk. He didn't wait. He shoved the pelts and the gold into the clerk's chest, knocking him back a step. "File it now." Elias turned, his own hand on his sidearm, and walked, not ran, toward the door. "Elias!" Barlow's voice was a sharp command. "Stop right there, you murdering son of a bitch!" Elias was through the door. He unhitched the mule's reins in one pull and swung himself into the saddle. He heard the office door slam open behind him. "Stop! That's an order!" Elias kicked the mule, hard. The animal bolted, slipping on the packed ice of the main street. A gunshot cracked the air, deafeningly loud. A bullet whined past his ear. He didn't look back. He hunched low, digging his heels in, and raced out of town. Leaving the shouting, the gold, and the pelts behind, he had his delay, and he had brought the devil to his doorstep. Back at the cabin, the silence was a living thing. Clara paced. Every creak of the roof, every snap of the fire, made her jump. She held the shotgun, its weight a cold comfort. Elias had been gone for hours. The sun was past its high point. She stopped at the window, wiping the frost. Nothing, just the endless blinding white. She heard it before she saw it. The crunch of hoofbeats. 2 horses, not one. Elias was alone. Her heart hammered. She ran to the door, checking the load in the shotgun. She moved back to the window. 2 men. She didn't recognize them. They were thick-set, wearing cheap hats and coats that looked too thin for the weather. They rode with a sloppy, arrogant slump.
They rode right up to the cabin, dismounted, and didn't even bother to tie their horses.
Clara stood in the center of the room, the shotgun held at her hip. The door was pushed open without a knock. The two men stepped inside, bringing a gust of cold air and the smell of stale whiskey. One was tall and thin-faced, with watery, cruel eyes. The other was short and broad, with a tangle of greasy hair. "Well, well," the tall one said, his voice oily. He looked around the cabin, his gaze lingering on the single cot, the two mugs by the fire. "Mrs. Barrow, I presume?"
"Who are you?"
Clara's voice was steadier than she felt.
"We're from the land office,"
the man said. Taking a step in, he didn't wipe his feet.
"Mr. Croft sent us. A formality. Just here to inspect the property."
"Inspect it for what?" "To confirm the abandonment notice," the man said, smiling. It was not a pleasant smile. "But it looks occupied." His eyes raked over her, from her worn boots to the frayed collar of her dress. "Very occupied, cozy even. Where's your helper, ma'am? We heard you had a big fella staying with you."
"Get out of my house," Clara said. "Now, that ain't neighborly."
The shorter man grunted, moving toward the hearth.
"We're just doing our job."
"This ain't your house for long, sweetheart," the tall one said. His name was Boone. He stepped closer. Clara stepped back. "Mr. Croft, he wants a full accounting of all the assets." He reached out a dirty, gloved hand, his fingers aiming for a strand of her hair. He said to be thorough. Clara had seen that look before. In Amos's eyes. The look that said she was a thing, an object. She did not freeze. She did not cry out. She moved. She was faster than he was, faster than she had ever been. She brought the greener shotgun up, shoved the twin barrels hard into his stomach, and then, in the same motion, angled the gun down and pulled the right trigger. The explosion was catastrophic. In the tiny, enclosed cabin, it was the sound of the world ending, a deafening, echoing blast that shook the tins on the shelf. The floor an inch from Boone's boot erupted in a spray of splinters, lead shot, and smoke. Boone screamed, a high-pitched, terrified sound. He stumbled back, falling over the stool, clutching his leg where the flying splinters had peppered his shin. The acrid smell of gunpowder filled the room, burning Clara's nose. The shorter man hadn't even moved. He was staring at her, his face white, his mouth open.
"Get out,"
Clara said, her voice a low, shaking growl. She did not move. She cocked the second hammer. The click was loud in the ringing silence. "The next one goes in your belly. Tell Silas Croft I'm occupying my land." Boone scrambled to his feet, whimpering.
"You crazy bitch! You shot me!"
"I shot the floor," Clara said, her voice as cold as the wind.
"But I won't miss twice. Go!"
They fell over each other, clawing their way out the door. They didn't bother with Grace, just threw themselves onto their horses and kicked them into a frantic gallop, disappearing down the path. Clara stood there. The shotgun was suddenly so heavy she could barely hold it. She let the barrel rest on the floor. She walked to the door, kicked it shut, and slid the heavy wooden bar into place. And only then did she lean against it. Her entire body, from her knees to her jaw, was shaking, a violent, uncontrollable tremor. She looked at the smoking, splintered hole in her floor. A small, hysterical laugh bubbled in her throat. She sank to the floor, her back against the door, and held the shotgun across her lap. She was terrified, and she had never felt so proud. Darkness had fallen when Elias burst in. He didn't knock. He slammed the door open, his body crashing against the bar she had forgotten to lift. "Clara!" He found her in the dark, still sitting on the floor, the shotgun in her lap. He was panting, his mule lathered, his face gray with exhaustion and fear.
"Are you hurt?"
he demanded, his eyes wild.
Did anyone come?"
"2 men," she said. Her voice was a dry croak. She pointed with her chin. "From Croft." Elias's gaze followed. He saw the new, jagged hole in the floorboards. He smelled the lingering, sharp scent of gunpowder. He looked at her, at the rigid set of her jaw. "What did you do?" he whispered. "I shot at his feet," she said, her voice starting to tremble as the shock wore off. He tried to touch me. I told them to tell Croft I was occupying the land." A dark, fierce pride lit his eyes, chasing the fear. He dropped to his knees in front of her. He touched her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "Good," he said, his voice rough. "That's good." He pulled her to her feet, his arms going around her, crushing her to him. "Elias, what happened?" she whispered into his coat. "You're shaking."
"Barlow is here,"
he said, his voice muffled in her hair. "The sheriff from Wyoming. He's in 3 Forks. He saw me." She pulled back, her blood turning to ice. "Here? For you?" "He's here for me, which means he knows I'm here, which means by morning, everyone will know. Croft, Barlow, they're connected now. It's all one fight." The cabin, her one tiny sanctuary, was no longer a shelter. It was a trap. The walls were closing in. The world was shrinking to this single, cold room. He didn't let her go. He just held her, his body a solid, trembling wall. The fear in the room was a physical thing, a third person, cold and heavy. He pushed her back, not gently, until she hit the cabin wall. His mouth found hers. It was not a kiss of tenderness. It was a claiming. It was a desperate, raw act of possession. It was not about love. It was about life. It was a frantic attempt to anchor themselves to the one solid thing they had in a world that was about to be torn apart. He ripped at the laces of her dress, his hands rough. She clawed at his shirt, her nails digging into his skin. They didn't make it to the cot. They fell onto the furs by the hearth, a collision of limbs and fear and desperate, aching need. This was not the slow, healing thaw of their first night. It was not the urgent promise of the second. This was a battle. His mouth was on her neck, her shoulder, her collarbone, tasting her, marking her. His hands were hard, gripping her hips, holding her down, as if he could erase every man who had ever tried to touch her, claim her, or hurt her. He was trying to burn Amos's ghost out of her memory. He was trying to erase the oily touch of Boone. He was trying to erase his own past, his own guilt, on her skin. And she met him. She wrapped her legs around him, her body arching up, taking him, holding him. She was not passive. She was not a victim. She was his equal. She was claiming him, just as he was claiming her. It was a raw, silent, desperate coupling, an act of pure defiance against the men and the laws and the cold that was coming to destroy them. It was the only answer they had. The next day, a new rider came. This one wore a badge, a local deputy, young, with nervous eyes but a practiced swagger. He didn't make it to the door. Elias had been watching the tree line since dawn. He moved like a shadow, intercepting the deputy by the half-finished fence. The deputy saw him, his eyes widening, his hand instinctively dropping to his revolver. Elias was faster. He had his skinning knife from his belt and pressed to the man's throat before the deputy's hand had even cleared the holster. "Give me the message," Elias growled. His voice was not the voice Clara knew. It was the voice of the man-catcher. Mr. Croft, he says," the deputy stammered, his Adam's apple bobbing against the steel. "He says the inspectors reported Mrs. Barrow as hostile. He says if she doesn't vacate in 48 hours, he's issuing a warrant for assault." The deputy took a shaky breath. "And for harboring a wanted fugitive." "Barlow," Elias breathed. The trap was sprung. "Go back," Elias said, the knife pricking the skin, a single drop of blood welling. "You tell Croft, and you tell that Wyoming bastard,
Barlow, you tell those 2 hounds he sent yesterday, the next person who sets foot on this land dies. I don't care if they wear a badge or not. I will kill them. You tell him Elias said so." He shoved the deputy back. The man stumbled, gasping, scrambled onto his horse, and fled. Elias watched him go, the coldness of the killer still on his face. That night, the snow began to fall. Not a blizzard, just a soft, heavy, silent descent. It was beautiful, and it was suffocating. It was walling them in. They sat by the fire. The rifle and the shotgun were loaded, leaning against the wall, within arm's reach. They had done all they could. They had made their stand. Now, they waited. Elias was staring into the flames, his jaw set, his mind a million miles away, planning angles, counting bullets. He was lost in the violence to come. Clara looked at him, at this huge, broken, dangerous man who had promised to fight for her. He was more than a protector. He was more than a lover. She needed to bring him back from that dark place, if only for a moment.
"Elias,"
she whispered. He turned, his gray eyes tired, haunted, but focused on her.
"I love you."
The words hung in the warm, silent air. She saw the shock in his face, a sudden vulnerability that cracked his hard expression. She saw a deep, aching desire to say it back. And she saw him refuse. He couldn't. He was a man with a price on his head. He was a man who believed he was a curse. He could not, would not, promise her a future he did not believe existed. He could not give her a word that meant forever. So he did not speak. He just reached for her, pulling her from the stool onto his lap. He wrapped his arms around her, his good arm and his wounded one, and held her so tightly she could barely breathe. He buried his face in her hair, his body a solid, warm shield. He did not say it back, but his arms, his entire body, said enough. The dawn did not come. It seeped into the valley, a cold, gray sickness that leached the color from the snow and the sky. There was no sound. The wind had died, and the world held its breath. Inside the cabin, they were waiting. They had been awake all night, the silence stretching between them, thick with the unspoken, the love confessed, the future, a black closing circle. Elias stood at the small window, a shadow against the gray. He had not slept. He had watched the tree line, his rifle oiled and ready in his hands. Clara sat at the table, the loaded shotgun resting across her lap. Her hands were steady. The tremor of the day before was gone, burned away by a cold, hard resolve. "They'll come with the light," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I'll be ready," she replied. He looked at her, at the set of her jaw, the way she held the weapon. She was not the same woman he had met. The terror had been scoured out of her, leaving something as hard and unyielding as the frozen earth. He heard it first, a faint creak of leather, the muffled crunch of hooves on deep snow. "Here," he breathed. He didn't have to look. He knew. It was not one horse. It was many. Clara moved to his side, peering through the other side of the frosted pane. They came out of the trees like wolves, dark shapes against the white. She counted 8, maybe 10. At the front rode Sheriff Barlow, his badge a dull star on his chest, his arm in a rough sling. Beside him was Silas Croft, his face pinched and purple with the cold and a vindictive, righteous anger. The men behind them were not deputies. They were hired guns, hard cases scraped from the floor of Croft's saloon. Boone was among them, his leg bandaged, his face a mask of hate. They did not ride to the door. They fanned out, their movements practiced, surrounding the small cabin in a loose, deadly ring. "Elias!" Barlow's voice was sharp, cutting the frozen air. "We know you're in there, you murdering bastard. You are under arrest for the murder of 2 Wyoming deputies. Come out with your hands high." Croft spurred his horse forward a few feet. "And Clara Barrow," You are harboring a fugitive and have been charged with assault on my men. You have 10 seconds to vacate the property before we burn it to the ground with you in it."
Elias looked at Clara. "Go to the root cellar, under the floorboards. Now!" "No," Clara said, her voice flat. She moved to the door, her back against the solid wood.
They're here for both of us. This is my land. This is my house. I'm not hiding.
"Clara, this is not a fight you can—" "I shot the floor," she interrupted, meeting his gaze. Her own eyes were as gray and cold as his. "Now I'm ready to shoot them." A heavy sigh escaped him. It was almost a laugh. "All right," he said. He moved to stand beside her, his rifle at his shoulder, pointed at the window. "On my count."
"Elias, last chance!" Barlow yelled.
A shot rang out, not from the cabin. One of Croft's men, trigger-happy, fired at the window. The glass exploded, showering the room in a spray of ice and shattered crystal. Elias shoved Clara hard, pushing her away from the wall. "Get down!" She stumbled, falling as a second shot tore through the thin planks where she had just been standing. Elias grunted, a sharp, choked sound, as a third bullet ripped through the wall, punching through the muscle of his right thigh. He collapsed, not falling, but folding against her. "I'm hit," he gasped, his face suddenly terrifyingly white. "No!" Clara screamed. She grabbed him under the arms, her fear a surge of desperate strength. "No, you don't!" The cabin erupted. It was no longer a standoff, it was a siege. Bullets thudded into the logs, a relentless, deadly drumming. Splinters flew through the air like hornets. She dragged him, his bad leg leaving a thick, dark smear on the floor, pulling him behind the stone hearth, the one solid corner of the house. He was bleeding, badly. The wool of his trousers was soaked dark red, the blood pulsing in a sickening, steady rhythm. "It's the artery," he panted, his hand clamping down on the wound. You have to fire. Keep them back." Clara was shaking again, the terror a cold, metallic taste in her mouth. She looked at his face, pale with shock, and at the blood pouring through his fingers. She looked at the walls of her home, being torn apart. She grabbed the shotgun. She crawled to the shattered window. She saw a man dismounting, running toward the door with a torch. She aimed and fired. The blast threw the man sideways into the snow, his torch extinguishing. "Reload!" Elias gasped from the floor. He was trying to reload his own rifle, but his hands were slick with his own blood. Clara scrambled back. She grabbed a strip of linen from her sewing box, shoving it against the wound in his leg. He cried out, his back arching. "Hold it!" she commanded, her voice high and tight. "Hold it hard!" Bullets ripped through the roof, sending sod and dust raining down on them. They were being chewed to pieces. They had minutes, at most. Clara looked at the wall, at the smoke and chaos outside. She saw the small, leaning shed, not 50 feet from the back of the cabin. The shed held the last of her dry hay, a few broken tools, and the half-empty can of Amos's lamp oil. "I need smoke," she whispered, her mind racing. "I need to blind them." "Clara, no!" Elias breathed, his eyes wide. "Don't you leave this cabin." "You keep them busy," she said. She grabbed the can of oil and the small tin of matches. "I'll be back." She didn't wait for him to argue. She crawled to the back wall, to the small, ill-fitting pantry door. Elias, seeing the suicidal resolve in her face, dragged himself up onto one elbow, rested his rifle on the floor, and fired 3 times, fast, at the men advancing on the east side. "Covering you!" he yelled. Clara burst from the pantry door, keeping low, a small, gray shadow against the snow. The world was a screaming chaos of gunfire and shouts. A bullet snapped past her head, so close she felt the heat of it. She didn't stop. She ran, stumbling, sinking into the drifts, her lungs burning. She reached the shed. She fumbled with the oil can, her hands numb. She splashed the dark, slick fluid over the dry wood, over the pile of hay in the corner. "She's in the shed," she heard Boone's voice roar. "Light her up." A bullet splintered the doorframe by her head. She dropped to her knees, striking a match. The sulfur flared. She threw it. The dry kindling, soaked in oil, did not catch. It erupted, a whoosh of flame and heat that blew her backward into the snow. A column of thick, oily, black smoke billowed into the gray sky. The wind, which had been still, seemed to awaken, catching the smoke and pushing it in a thick, choking blanket, directly into the faces of Barlow's and Croft's men. She heard them coughing, cursing, their line breaking as the world vanished into a black, stinging haze. Inside the cabin, Elias saw the smoke. A dark, proud smile touched his lips. "That's my girl," he whispered. He pushed himself up, ignoring the fire in his leg. He crawled to the shattered window. The world outside was a churning mass of smoke. He could see nothing. He waited. A shadow appeared, coughing, waving his arms. A deputy. Lost, staggering out of the cloud. Elias took aim. The rifle bucked against his good shoulder. The shadow fell. Another man burst through, his face a mask of rage. Firing wildly into the smoke, it was Boone. "I'll kill her," he screamed, moving toward the shed. "No, you won't," Elias said. He centered the sight on the man's chest. He fired. The shot was perfect. Boone stopped, looked down at his own chest as if surprised, and then pitched forward into the snow. The effort was the last thing he had. The rifle slid from his grasp. The world, which had been sharp and clear, dissolved into gray. He slumped against the wall, his eyes closing, and knew nothing. Clara ran back to the cabin, her hair singed, her lungs full of smoke. She scrambled through the pantry door. "Elias!" He was on the floor, his face the color of ash. He was not moving. The makeshift bandage on his leg was a solid, sodden mass of red. "No," she breathed. "No, Elias." She crawled to him, grabbing his face. "Elias, wake up, wake up!" He was cold. Outside, the shooting had stopped. The smoke was beginning to clear. She heard Barlow's voice, triumphant and cruel. "He's down! I saw him fall! The murdering bastard is down! Croft, get your men! We're going in! Get the woman!" Clara grabbed the fallen rifle. She tried to reload it, her hands shaking so badly she dropped the cartridge. She had the shotgun, but it was empty. It was over. She heard the crunch of boots on the snow, the heavy footsteps of men advancing, coming to finish it. She threw herself over Elias's body, her back to the door, and waited for the final killing shot. A new sound, a sound that did not belong. The thunder of new horses, coming fast from the east, and a voice, a great, bellowing roar that shook the valley. "Silas Croft, you yellow-bellied, land-thieving bastard! That's far enough!" Clara crawled to the window, her heart stopping. It was Abner Potts, her neighbor, 12 miles east, the man whose wife she had sat with for 2 days, helping birth their first son when the midwife was trapped by a blizzard. He was there, on a huge bay horse, and behind him were 6 hired hands from his ranch, all armed with repeating rifles, all spread out in a perfect skirmish line. "My God," she whispered. Barlow, Croft, and their 2 remaining men froze, caught in the open between the smoking cabin and Abner's line. "This is official territorial business," Barlow shouted, raising his revolver. "Stand down, or you'll be arrested for interfering." "This is theft!" Abner roared back, his rifle leveled at Croft's chest. "I've been watching you, Croft. I saw your men ride out here 2 days ago to threaten a widow. And I see a Wyoming sheriff 100 miles out of his jurisdiction, leading a pack of saloon trash. That's not law, Barlow. That's a lynching party, and it ends now." A shot rang out. One of Abner's men, seeing Barlow raise his pistol, had fired. The bullet tore through the fleshy part of Barlow's wounded arm. The sheriff screamed, dropping his gun,
He looked at his 2 dead men in the snow. He looked at the smoking shed. He looked at the 6 rifles aimed at his gut. He looked at Croft, who was already turning his horse. "This ain't over! Elias!" he screamed at the cabin. He clutched his bleeding arm, spurred his horse, and he and Croft and the last of their men fled, disappearing back into the trees. The silence that fell was absolute. Clara heard boots on her porch.
Clara?
Abner's voice was gentle now. She unbarred the door. He stood there, a giant of a man, his face grim. He took in the scene, the splintered walls, the smoking hole in the floor, and the 2 people by the hearth. "My God, child," he breathed, stepping in. What did they do? Clara was already back with Elias, cradling his head in her lap. "He's dying, Abner." She wept, the cold resolve finally breaking, her body shaking with sobs.
"He's dying! Please, help me!"
Elias's skin was waxy, cold to the touch. The blood was still sluggishly weeping from 2 wounds. His breathing was a shallow, wet rattle in his chest. Abner knelt beside them. He put his rough hand on Elias's neck. "He's alive, barely, Jed. Ride for Doc Miller. Ride that horse till it drops."
"He won't make it,"
Clara cried, her tears falling onto Elias's pale face.
"Elias, please, hold on. Stay with me. Please, I love you. Hold on."
His eyelids flickered. A spark, deep in the gray. He was trying to see her. He was trying to lift his hand. She grabbed it, his fingers cold and limp, and pressed it to her cheek.
"I'm here. I'm right here."
His lips moved, a dry, cracking sound. He managed a single ragged breath, his chest rising and falling. "You," he whispered, his voice a thread. "You gave me more than I ever gave you." His eyes closed, his hand went limp in hers.
"No!"
she screamed. Abner's hand was on her shoulder. "He's not gone, Clara. He's just gone under. We have to stop the bleeding. Now!" The night was a blur, a long, cold, waking nightmare. Abner's man returned, alone. The doctor was in another county. Wouldn't be back for 3 days. Abner stayed. He built up the fire. He and Clara worked. They heated the knife in the flames. They dug out the bullet from his thigh. They poured whiskey into the raw, gaping wounds. Elias never stirred. They stitched him up with her fishing line. They wrapped him in every blanket they had. Clara sat by the cot, holding his hand, all through the long, dark hours. His body was a furnace, the fever raging. Then, just as dawn approached, he became terribly cold, his breathing so shallow she had to put her ear to his lips to feel it. She held him, her arms wrapped around his still body. Trying to give him her own warmth, she whispered to him, her voice hoarse, her throat raw from smoke and grief. She told him about the spring. She told him about the smell of the thaw, of the first crocuses. She told him about Oregon, about the green valleys she'd read about. She planned a future, painting it in the air, a desperate, fragile prayer. She spoke of what might come next, if he just made it, if they made it. She didn't know when she fell asleep, her head on his chest. She woke to the sunlight, warm. The cabin was quiet. She sat up, a moment of pure, disorienting panic. She looked down. Elias was staring at her. His eyes were open. They were clear. The fever had broken. He was pale as death, but he was looking at her. He tried to speak. Only a dry cough came out. She scrambled for the water ladle, her hands shaking. She lifted his head, holding the water to his cracked lips. He drank. He looked at her, his gaze taking in her singed hair, the smoke stains on her face, the blood on her dress. "Abner," he rasped. "He's outside," she whispered, the tears starting again. But this time, they were not for grief. He's watching the property. He brought food." Elias let his head fall back onto the pillow. He looked at the sunlight streaming through the shattered window.
at the bullet holes in his new fence. He turned his head and looked at her. He was alive. He had survived the night. They had survived. And in the quiet of the morning, surrounded by the wreckage of their home, he slowly, painfully, lifted his hand, and he did not wait for her to take it. He reached for hers. The thaw came slowly, not as a flood, but as a reluctant concession. The world dripped. The snow line retreated up the mountains, leaving behind a scarred, brown earth that steamed in the pale, new sunlight. Weeks had passed since the battle, weeks of slow, agonizing healing. Elias limped. The wound in his thigh had healed badly, the muscle torn, the scar a puckered, angry knot, but he was alive, and he was working. The cabin, once a sieve of bullet holes, was now patched with fresh-cut, pale yellow pine. The sound of his hammer was the new rhythm of the valley, a steady, defiant beat. Thud, thud, thud. Clara worked beside him, handing him the spikes, her hands now calloused and sure. The haunted, brittle woman was gone. In her place was someone grounded, rooted in the land she had almost lost. They spoke little, but the silence was a comfortable, shared thing. It was the quiet of two people who had seen the worst and had chosen to stay. Abner Potts had been true to his word. He had ridden to Helena, not to the local land office, but to the territorial marshal himself. He had returned not just with the marshal, but with the young, terrified clerk from Silas Croft's office. The clerk, with both Croft and Barlow in irons, had sung like a meadowlark. He told them everything. Croft's scheme to steal the land, the conspiracy with Barlow, the plan to use Elias's warrant as a legal excuse for a lynching. The trial was set in Three Forks, but it was the marshal's court, not Croft's. On a bright, cold morning, the marshal himself rode out to the homestead. He handed Clara a folded piece of paper. It was the deed, clean, registered, and stamped. Her name was written on it in clear, black ink. Clara Barrow, sole proprietor. She held it, her hands trembling. It was the first thing in her life that was truly, unconditionally hers. She looked up at Elias, who was leaning against the new fence line, watching her. He was not smiling, not truly, but his gray eyes were soft, the pride in them a visible, warm thing. They rode into town together for the trial. The main street was packed. Men had come down from the high country, ranchers from 50 miles away, all to see the two wolves. Barlow and Croft, finally brought to heel. Clara and Abner sat in the front row. Silas Croft looked small, his fine suit rumpled, his face a pasty, sweating gray. Sheriff Barlow sat beside him in chains, his arm in a dirty sling, his blue eyes no longer cold, just dead. The clerk testified, his voice shaking. Abner testified, his voice a bellow of righteous anger that shook the windows. And then the marshal called his final witness.
Elias.
A hush fell. The back door of the courtroom opened, and Elias walked in, flanked by two deputies. He was not in chains, but he was a prisoner, a protected witness. He limped heavily as he walked to the stand, his gaze fixed, not on Barlow, but on Clara. He took the oath. "Please state your name for the court." The prosecutor said, "Elias," he said, just the one word. "And what is your profession?" "I was a bounty hunter." "Is that how you knew Sheriff Barlow?" "Yes, he hired me."
"And did he hire you to apprehend the boy, Jamie?"
Barlow's head shot up. Croft looked at his lawyer in panic. Elias's gaze found Barlow's, and he held it.
"Yes, he hired me to murder him."
For an hour, he spoke. His voice was low, steady, and devoid of emotion. He told them everything. He told them about Jamie, about the $60, about the freight wagon, about the murder he had committed for a corrupt sheriff. He told them about being hunted, about the bullet he took. He told them about the siege, about Boone and the others.
He did not just testify against Barlow. He confessed his own sins, laying them bare for the town, for the marshals, and for Clara to hear. He was damning Barlow, but he was damning himself, too. When he finished, there was not a sound in the courtroom. He had painted a picture of a darkness so complete, it had poisoned 2 territories. He stepped down, his face pale, the confession having cost him the last of his strength. He did not look at Clara as the deputies led him back out. The verdict was quick, guilty, for both of them, for fraud, for conspiracy, for attempted murder. The judge, his face grim, sentenced them to hang. The town exploded. Men cheered, throwing their hats in the air. Justice had, for once, been done. Clara pushed through the crowd, her heart hammering. She found Elias outside the courthouse, standing between his guards, waiting. The territorial marshal approached him. "You did a good thing, son," the marshal said, his voice quiet. "You put away 2 bad men, and you cleared that boy's name." "What about my warrant?" Elias asked, his voice flat. The marshal sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I sent a wire to Wyoming, the new sheriff down there. He's not as forgiving as I am. The warrant for the murder of Barlow's deputies is still active. Legally, my hands are tied. Son." He looked at the sun, which was beginning to dip. "I can hold them off. I can say your testimony is ongoing. I can give you 24 hours. After that, I have to honor the warrant. If you're still in this territory, I have to arrest you." Elias nodded. He had known. "I understand." "Go," the marshal said. "Go south. Don't stop." Clara found him by the mule, at the edge of town where the road turned south toward the pass. He was checking the saddle, his movement stiff and slow. The setting sun cast his shadow long and thin across the snow. She stood there, her heart a cold, hard knot. He had saved her, and now he was leaving her. "Elias," she said. He stopped, his hand on the saddle horn. He turned to face her. The hard mask of the man-catcher was back. He was the stranger at her door again, preparing to disappear into the wilderness. "I told you," he said, his voice rough. "I bring trouble." "You brought me my life," she said, her voice shaking, not with fear, but with a fierce, hot anger. "You brought me. She strode forward. She did not cry. She did not plead. She put her hands on his rough coat, grabbed him, and pulled his face down to hers. She kissed him. It was not a goodbye. It was a brand. It was a fierce, desperate, bruising kiss that tasted of gunpowder and winter and a promise. It was not a kiss of hope. It was a kiss of will. She poured all the strength he had shown her, all the fight he had taught her, all the love he could not say, into that one, violent, final press of her mouth against his. She pulled back, her eyes blazing, her breath coming in gasps. "You come back," she ordered. It was not a request. "I don't care how, I don't care when, you come back to me. Do you understand?" He looked at her, his gray eyes shattered, the mask broken. He saw the woman she had become, a woman as strong as the mountains, a woman who had faced down death and had not flinched. He could not speak the words. He could not promise a future he couldn't see. So he just nodded, a single, sharp, pained motion. "Go," she whispered, her resolve cracking, the tears finally coming. She shoved him, gently. "Go, before I beg you to stay." Elias swung his leg over the mule. He looked at her one last time, his gaze memorizing her face, her strength, her fire. Then he turned the mule south, and he rode. He did not look back. Clara stood in the frozen road until he was a tiny, black speck against the dying, blood-red sun. Then she, too, turned, and she walked back to her land, alone. The months passed. The last of the snow melted. The high country streams roared. The world turned from brown to a brilliant, violent green. Clara worked. She worked from the black of dawn until the last purple light faded. She did not just survive. She built. She finished the cabin, her home, her fortress. The inside was clean, the floors scrubbed, the bullet holes patched. She took the 10 prime pelts Elias had left her and rode to town. She sold them for $100. She bought 2 new laying hens. She bought a piglet, which she penned behind the cabin. She bought seed. She bought a new, sharp axe. She was no longer just the widow Barrow. She was Clara. She was the woman who had faced down Silas Croft. She was the woman Abner Potts greeted with a deep, respectful nod. Her loneliness was a different thing. Now, it was not the cold, empty ache of before. It was a sharp, focused point. It was the empty space beside her on the cot. It was the missing sound of his hammer. It was a loneliness that was, in itself, a form of hope, a waiting. One day, in late summer, the mailboy rode up. He was smiling. "Got a letter for you, ma'am, all the way from Wyoming." She took it, her hands steady, though her heart had stopped. The envelope was rough. There was no return address. The postmark just said Cheyenne. She opened it. The handwriting was rough, labored, the letters big and childish. It was from a man who was more comfortable with an axe than a pen. It was 3 sentences. "I am here. They are not. I think of the hearth." She closed her eyes, clutching the small, precious piece of paper to her chest. A single, dry, sharp sob of pure, unadulterated relief escaped her. He was alive. He was free. He was thinking of her. Spring came again. The land was alive. The air smelled of wet earth and new pine. Clara had spent the winter working with Abner's men, trading her mending and cooking for their labor. They had built a new, proper barn, high and strong, near the fence line. She was in the loft, stacking the last of the winter hay. The sun was low, streaming through the new-cut slats in the wall, casting long, golden bars across the floor. It was warm. A shadow fell across the open barn door. Clara froze. Her hand went to the small knife she now wore on her belt. A man was standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the bright afternoon light. He was thinner than she remembered, and he stood straight, not favoring either leg. He was clean-shaven, his hair cut short. He looked different. He stepped into the light. It was Elias. But it was not. The gaunt, hunted look was gone. The heavy beard was gone, replaced by a thick, trimmed mustache. He looked younger and infinitely more tired. But the eyes were the same pale, gray storms. He looked around the barn, at the new stalls, the full feed sacks, the healthy piglet in its pen. He looked at her, standing in the loft, her face smudged with dust. "You've been busy," he said, his voice. It was the same, that same low, gravelly sound that had haunted her dreams. She did not speak. She could not. He took a step in, his hands held open at his sides. "My name," he said, his voice hesitant, as if the words were new, "is John Ayers, the marshal. He took care of it. Elias he's dead. Barlow died in the prison in Helena. An accident, the Wyoming warrant, it died with him." He looked at her, his gaze desperate, vulnerable. "I'm a free man, Clara." She just stared at him, her heart a wild, trapped bird in her chest. All the months of waiting, of steeling herself, of building a life alone, were crashing down around her. He looked around the barn, his gaze landing on the small cot she had set up in the loft for warm nights. A blanket and a pillow on the hay. "I heard a widow lived here," he said, a small, nervous clearing of his throat. "A tough one. I was just wondering if the bed's still warm." The words, the waiting, the fear, the anger, the sheer, stupid, impossible hope of it all. It all boiled over. She came down the ladder so fast she almost fell. She strode across the barn floor, her boots silent in the hay. She stood in front of him, this new man who was her man. She slapped him. A hard, flat-palmed smack, not on his face, but on his chest. The sound was sharp, echoing in the quiet of the barn. "You're late," she said, her voice a thick, choked whisper. And then she grabbed the front of his new, clean shirt with both hands, pulled his face down to hers, and kissed him. It was not a kiss of battle. It was not a kiss of desperation. It was a kiss of homecoming. It was the kiss of the thaw, of the green earth, of the quiet, solid promise of a future. It was everything they had almost lost. He responded, his arms coming around her, lifting her clear off the ground. He was strong. His leg was healed. He carried her, his mouth never leaving hers, and climbed the ladder to the loft. He laid her down on the cot, on the blankets, in the hay. The setting sun poured through the slats, bathing them in stripes of warm, golden light. He touched her face, his clean-shaven skin rough against her palm. She began to tremble. He began to tremble. It was not from fear. It was not from shame. It was from the sheer, crushing, unbelievable weight of what they had survived. The gunfire, the blood, the trial, the long, cold, empty months of separation. They were here. They were alive. They were whole. He laid his head on her chest, his arms wrapped around her waist, holding her as if she were the only anchor in the world. He was silent for a long, long time, the only sound the settling of the barn, the breathing of the animals below. A low rumble started in his chest. It was a ghost of a laugh. "One night," he whispered, his voice muffled against her. "For 10 furs, huh?" Clara smiled, a slow, sure smile. She ran her fingers through his short, clean hair, her lips brushing the top of his head. "I gave you far more," she whispered, her voice full of a love she no longer had to hide. "And I'll keep giving it, long as you stay." He tightened his grip, his body a solid, warm, unmoving promise against hers. He was staying. Thank you for listening to this story from Wild West Love Tales. We truly hope you enjoyed the journey of Clara and Elias. Where in the world are you listening from? We would love to know. Please leave a comment and tell us. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to From Wild West to be sure you never miss a new story. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this one, so please share them in English in the comments below. Until next time, stay safe.